Uh, David and Patrick, thank you very much for those wonderful introductions. I greatly appreciate it. And thank you everyone who carved out the time to engage in such an important conversation. I think we're going to have a robust presentation and dialogue following. If you will bear with me, I'm going to switch to share screen so I can pull up some charts that I will take you guys through as I do the talk. Here we go. So as was said, my name is Sean Rochester, and I wrote this book called The Black Tax, The Cost of Being Black in America. And in that book, I look at the financial cost of discrimination against Black people. Now, normally when people think about discrimination, they tend to think about it from the perspective of the injustice or the immorality associated with it. I wanted to take a different look at it. I want to look at what is the cost of discrimination, and more importantly, what does research from the finest institutions in the country say that that cost is. So the book is broken into three parts. In the first part of the book, I look at the financial cost of discrimination in the present context, right? And markets that are really critical for wealth accumulation for people in general, for Black people in particular. So that's housing, it's automotive, it's the insurance and finance that underpin that. It's the job search, high-end careers, it's online commerce, capital raising for business, so on and so forth. In the second part of the book, I do a look back from the time of slavery and kind of just walk through and discuss a number of discriminatory practices that we may or may not be aware of, but I look at it from an economic perspective in terms of quantifying it. In the third part of the book, I kind of summarize where we are economically, at this point in time. And then I propose an economic framework that I call PhD, that stands for Purchase, Hire, and Deposit, in ways that create jobs, create and expand businesses, and provide capital in the Black community. The reason that is so important, that framework, is because, pre-COVID, we're missing about 6 million jobs across the, broader Black community. We're missing about 1.4 million businesses with employees. So those businesses that are large enough to actually have employees. Some people are aware that there are about 2.56 million Black businesses. Most folks aren't aware that only about 4% of those actually have any of those have any employees. And that 4% generates about 70% of the revenue from all of Black enterprise, almost $100 billion, and they employ about 1 million people. There are roughly around 109 or 110,000 of those companies, and we're missing 1.4 million of those. On top of that, you also have the wealth gap, which is actually extraordinary. There are all kinds of numbers that are reported on that, but on average, if you look at the mean values, the difference per family between Black and white is roughly $841,000 across the average family. Which is extraordinary. And those three things are driving almost all the socioeconomic challenges that we're dealing with. Now, so these are really, really big problems, right? And really big challenges. And as is the case, when you're dealing with big problems and big challenges, you get a lot of people together at the table to work on those challenges, right? Much like we have, on this webinar today. But there's a challenge, right? When it comes to really effective problem solving, even when you do have a lot of people together, it's tough to work on problems if A, people don't see the problem, or B, they think you're the problem, right? So if you would just fix you, like, we would be great. Now I'm share with you a couple of platitudes that you may be, familiar with. One is Black folks are simply not trying hard enough. That has more to do with not getting ahead than any type of racial discrimination. You got over 6 in 10 Americans believe that. You have that Black people have the same or even a better chance, quite frankly, than white folks to get ahead in America. You got over 6 in 10 Americans believe that. Or you might have heard that racism, quite frankly, is an excuse for failure. The failure is mine. Instead of me kind of owning it and fixing it, I kind of spend all my time pointing a finger at other people, right? You got over 7 in 10 Americans that believe that. Now, the challenge with that is if that's the background thinking and resonance, then that thinking kind of shows up in a very policy plans and programs and solutions that are devised to handle these issues, right? The other thing that's very important to know and to understand is that effective problem solving is based on a foundation of empathy and understanding. with empathy being our ability to put ourselves in other people's shoes, to see things from their perspective, and to also to understand the pathology, right? Like how did they get there in the first place? And with understanding being our ability to use data and information to make the world a better place for ourselves and for our fellow man, right? So I want to share with you a quote from Albert Einstein that he gave in an address to the National Urban League back in 1946. And he said, "We must make every effort to ensure that the past injustice and violence and economic discrimination, which by definition is the black tax, will be made known to the people. The taboo, let's not talk about it, must be broken." So taking advice and counsel from Mr. Einstein, let's talk about it. So in the short period that we have together this evening, what I'm going to do is talk about how is it that after 400 years, more than 400 years, that over 45 million African Americans own just about 2% of U.S. wealth. Like, how is that possible over that length of time, right? So either we are colossally and consistently inept, or there is something going on in the environment that we really need to take a much closer look at, right? So let's do that. Let's try to take a closer look at that environment. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back, right, to the time of slavery. I'm not going to describe the horrors of that institutions, right? There are volumes written about that. But I do want to look at things from an economic perspective, right? But one of the first things that I need us all to understand is that slavery, by definition, is a 100% tax on an enslaved person's labor. It means that nothing that you produce is yours, not even you, right, are yours. Now, there are many things from this time period that you could never value, right? You could never value what it would be to be a man and to be unable to protect your loved ones. You could never value what it is to be a woman and to be unable to control your body, right, for the entirety of your lifetime. But there are things that you can value. For example, the labor extracted from millions of people over almost, a 250-year period. We were talking from 1619 to roughly 1865. And some economists have taken a look at that. Some place the number as high as 24 trillion. Others place it as high as 97 trillion. If we assume that the truth is somewhere in the middle, then it could be as high as 50 trillion extracted from millions of people over almost a quarter of a millennia. And while that number is large, and you may be unfamiliar with it, it is not the only thing that you can value from that time period. If we fast forward to about 1860, right, we have almost 4 million people held in bondage, right, at that time. And those people represent the most liquid asset in the country. They're 50% of the full economic value of the South. And they're traded in open markets. There's a price if you're old, there's a price if you're young, there's a price if you're able-bodied or lame, there's a price if you're male or female, so on and so forth, right? So you can calculate the value of those people. Now, it turns out that the value is so large that you actually need to measure it in terms of national wealth or national income, right? So from a wealth perspective, economists place it between 16 and 20% of US wealth at the time in 1 to 2 years of GDP or national income. So if you look at it from a wealth perspective, we're talking about 15.5 trillion. How do you come up with that number, right? Well, at the time that I did this work and this study, national wealth was about $85 trillion. 16 to 20% of that is 14 to 17 trillion. You take an average of that, you're at 15.5. That's one mode of valuing those folks. If you look at it from an income perspective, it's about 28.5 trillion. How do you arrive at that number? Well, 1 to 2 years of GDP. GDP pre-COVID was about 19 trillion a year. 1 to 2 years of that is 19 to 38 trillion. Take an average of those two, you're at 28.5. It's two separate independent modes of valuing those people in today's kind of context. If you take an average of those, you're at 22 trillion. You could go back even further, right? You can go back into like 1839, where you got Henry Clay on the floor of the US Senate, is laying out what the value of people held in bondage is to his fellow senators. He places that value at $1.2 billion in that time. If we look at the work from economist Thomas Piketty, he lays out that the annual return on slave-related investments is between 6 and 8% per annum. So if you use a more conservative number outside of that range, 5.5%, and you bring that number forward, you're at over $24 trillion. Now you could say, well, who's this Henry Clay guy? Why should we care what he has to say? We could go back even further, right, into the 1810s, and we could look at what Thomas Jefferson and James Madison are saying about the matter. And they placed the value of people held in bondage at that time at roughly 1 year of GDP, which pre-COVID would be about $19 trillion, or the equivalent of selling 1/3 of all publicly available land. So the idea here and the central message is we're talking about massive, really hard to conceive numbers in terms of value extracted from people and the value of those people themselves, right, to the country. So when you start to think about slavery, we're talking about really massive numbers, right? Now you can say, okay, that's huge. I didn't kind of see that coming. And it was bad. I didn't realize it was that bad. But, you know, truth be told, this was a long time ago. It's well over 150 years ago. You know, other people have come here. They have struggled. They have been discriminated against. But yet they have gone on to do well. There's been enough time to be in a better state than we're in right now. One could say that. But we have to remember that people left bondage with principally no economic resources, right? There was some talk about a land distribution, right, which was this whole 40 acres and a mule. That did not happen, right? For Black people, there was also, you know, the actual distribution, which took place, which was the Homestead Act. So one of the things I've always thought was interesting is to be able to really juxtapose those two. Now, what I want to talk about right before juxtaposing that is just the economic implication of the enormous value of people held in bondage, right? Now, what's the value or the net worth of Black people today, right? 45 million Black people is roughly $1.5 trillion. Now, we said that the economic value of people held in bondage at that time and today's equivalent was roughly 22 trillion, which would imply that the value of 4 million people held in bondage in 1860, well over 150 years ago, had 15 times more economic value of 45 million free people today in terms of their net worth. Pretty extraordinary thing. But let's kind of fast forward and talk a little bit about, what's kind of happening post-emancipation and the fact that people didn't really start with any economic resources. Now, previously I mentioned kind of 40 acres and a mule and the Homestead Act, right? So let's talk just a little bit about that. Because we all know the distribution for 40 acres and a mule never happened, right? But an interesting question is, if it had happened, what would that have been worth in today's dollars, right? You got 4 million people kind of held in bondage who were freed. If each of those folks received a 40-acre parcel, let's kind of put the mule aside for the moment, right? And just kind of talk about the land. And that would be about 160 million acres. It's a massive number, right? It's hard to conceive. I once looked at buying 400 acres with a group of friends. And for 400 acres, you got to go up in a helicopter, right? To really see what that looks like. So imagine the enormity, right, of 160 million acres. Now, if we think about what would that be worth in today's dollars, we can look at, what's the average price of an acre of land? Well, it ranges to about $3,020 on average to as high as $6,350. Now, these are farm acres that we're talking about, right? This is not Manhattan acres or Bay Area acres or Miami South Beach acres, right? This is kind of farm acres. So quick math would put that value of that at about $1 trillion on the high end, generating about $90 billion per year, right? $1 trillion is a large number on an absolute basis, but when you compare it with the 50 trillion extracted, it's only about 2%. So not even 2% of what was extracted from those people was allowable for the startup cash, right? Now, if you fast forward just a little bit to 1862, there is an actual land distribution that happens, right? And that's associated with this Homestead Act. And what happened is this was passed in 1862, and over the next 60 years, they would distribute about 246 million acres to roughly 1.5 million white families, right? Now, if you do the same kind of pricing dynamic in terms of a per acre basis, we're talking about up to $1.6 trillion on the high end, which is a little more than $1 million per family, right? So I'm all about hard working and bootstrapping, right? But $1 million is a hell of a bootstrap. Now, how did this whole thing work, right? So with the Homestead Act, you had the opportunity to claim about 160 acres of land. And if you were so fortunate to make that claim, if you stayed on that land for 5 years, you could take possession of it at the end of that time period. Now, if you came from Europe during that period of time, nothing but the shirt on your back, but you were so fortunate to be able to make one of these claims, at the end of 5 years, not only would you take possession of that land, but you would also become a citizen, right? That's about how long it took to naturalize back in those days. So imagine that extraordinary start, right, in life, by being so fortunate to have this opportunity. Now, researchers say that in terms of direct beneficiaries, there are about up to 93 million white Americans that are direct beneficiaries of this, not primary, not secondary, tertiary, or related in some kind of way, direct beneficiaries of this. Now, so 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 if we fast forward just a little, because we're at 1862, you move forward to 1865 and beyond, civil war has occurred, right? The Southern economy has been devastated. The global cotton market is devastated. The land confiscated in the South is returned, right, to the white planter class, and all of that land was confiscated. And there is a need for massive, cheap, readily available, and abundant labor, right? So I just want to double back here and kind of talk about one aspect of this that's really important. So when I say the global cotton market is devastated, this is a really important point. You have to think of cotton as the equivalent of oil at that time. The first truly global market, right? There's 20 million people employed in cotton production in one form or fashion. 1 million of those people lose their jobs. The US dominates 80% of the global market. You cannot beat free labor. And raw cotton in the South is about 61% of US exports. This reduction in production because of the war and the devastation causes what's known as a global cotton famine. It affects everywhere. It affects India, it affects Egypt, it affects Europe, of course, it affects Japan, the whole real industrialized world. And the world is crying out, what is America going to do to put her newly freed people back to work, right? So the answer for that question is this thing called Jim Crow, an amazingly nondescript name, right, for an institution. Like, what is Jim Crow and what does it mean? Well, what it is a system of laws and customs, right, that are reinforced with an extraordinary level of violence to reimpose a 100% tax on a sharecropper's labor. Now, I know what you're thinking. Sean, I like the numbers, I like the context, but you're saying 100% tax. We know those people were poor, but surely they had something. Sounds like you're a little hyperbolic, right? Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to let you decide whether or not it was 100% tax, right? So let's kind of continue. So what was sharecropping and how did it work? So after the war and emancipation, these large mega plantations are broken into smaller lots. Black families, would settle on those lots and agree to plant cash crops, right? And in exchange for doing so and bringing those crops to market, they would share in a portion of the crop. Literally, sharecropping is where the name comes from, right? Sounds feasible, but here's the challenge. It's actually a labor contract, right? And all the terms and conditions of that contract are set by the white farmer. The other thing, and some of those terms and conditions say that if you fall ill, they have the right to outsource your labor to someone else and charge you back for that. The other thing that's important to understand is, these people have principally no economic resources, right? And the crop doesn't come tomorrow. The harvest doesn't come tomorrow, right? It comes at the end of the season or at the end of the year. And between now and then, that white landowner has to provide the sharecropper with food and clothes and shelter and tools and fertilizer and everything that they need to bring that crop to market, right? And they're doing so at interest rates as high as 70% per year. So they effectively are setting your cost structure, right? Here's the other thing that's really important to know and understand, that when the harvest comes and you bring the crop to market, that white farmer is the market. He tells you what your crops are worth. Now, if someone tells you what your crops are worth, that means that they control your revenue or your income. And if somebody controls your income and they control your cost structure, by definition, they control your profit. I think you see where I'm going with this 100% tax. Now, if you are fortunate, your profit will net to zero. If you are unfortunate, because they don't want you to go to someone else who might be more generous, then they're going to make your profit negative, right? And they're going to take that negative profit, i.e. you owe them, and roll it over into the following year. And now you're in perpetual debt servitude, right? Now, I know what you're thinking, which is the same thing I would be thinking, which is, Sean, that's a horrible deal. I would never take that deal. So, and I get it, and it makes a lot of sense. But if you take that option, then they have a law for that. And those laws are vagrancy laws. And they state that if you cannot prove that you're a landowner and you cannot prove that you're gainfully employed, they can charge you with a criminal offense and put you in a state or county jail. Now, you might say, well, I didn't see that one coming. You know, I might sign that agreement. But you know what? After second consideration, I'm just not going to do it because it's a bad deal, right? If you do that, they got laws for that. And those are called contract enforcement laws, which state that you signed that labor contract and you broke it. And as such, they can charge you with a criminal offense and put you in a state or county jail. Now, you might say, fine, put me in jail. I will sit there. You could feed me 3 square meals a day until you're good and ready. And then you can let me out and I'll go about my business. If you take that option, then they have something for that. It's called convict leasing. And under convict leasing, they will lease you back to the very same white landowner that you did not want to work for, or to a private corporation. Now, there's something that I need you to understand about convict leasing, that in one respect, you could argue is even worse than slavery in this one respect, which is that while a slave owner will kill you or beat you within an inch of your life, slaves are expensive, right? And they would much rather have you around for another 5 or 10 or 15 years to maximize the return on the investment, right? So they have an interest in your value beyond today. They have an interest in what's known as your residual value, right? Under convict leasing, they have no such interest. They only care about what they can extract from you under the contract term, 6 months, 8 months, 18 months, that's it. Your future well-being outside of that, they have no interest in. And under those conditions, mortality rates are approaching 50%. That's a 1 in 2 chance of death under that situation. And while that is draconian, what we have to understand is that it's extremely lucrative. If you go back to 1914 and you look at the state of Alabama, 20% of the state's revenue at that time is coming from convict leasing alone. And there are estimates that this number is considerably higher, right? So that's a pretty powerful kind of construct. And something that's interesting to think about is what kind of environment would have to be in place to really impose this upon literally millions of people in a sustainable way, right? So if we kind of look at that just a little bit, you can see Professor Roback from Yale says that, you know, you can think of these Jim Crow laws, or they can be best understood as a way to enforce otherwise unenforceable labor market cartel among white farmers, right? What they're saying is there is only so much you can do with prejudice and discrimination alone. If you really want to maximize the impact, you need to bring the law in place. The laws were necessary to do what prejudice and discrimination alone couldn't do in and of itself. Now, if you go to 1883, you see that there's a Supreme Court decision that is handed down, and it effectively invalidates the original civil rights legislation from 1875. Effectively, it is saying that the government has no right to prevent private citizens or private corporations from discriminating against Black people. Here's why this is particularly important. As we all know, we live in a capitalist society. And what that means is that the means and mode of production is in the hands of private citizens, individuals, and private corporations. And this law says that they have the ability to discriminate to Black people, and there's nothing that the government can say about it, right? You also have the decision in 1896 that we're all familiar with. This is the whole separate but equal, decision that is allowing discrimination in the public sector on the basis that if you keep the facilities equal, then you can discriminate. We all know that the facilities weren't equal. I'll talk a little bit about that, as we're kind of going forward. So what you basically have here is a structure that's allowing unfettered discrimination at all levels, right? And you can see how states are reacting to this, right? Mississippi, they're setting up state constitutional conventions. Stated purpose for Mississippi, crushing the manhood of Negro citizens. Or Louisiana, where they're talking about establishing the supremacy of the white race. By the way, Black voter registration plummets 99% after that. And then even the state of Virginia, stated purpose to discriminate to the very extremity of permissible action. It's a pretty profound forward statement to make. So if you look at the work of Gary Becker, who wrote The Economics of Discrimination, an excellent book, and he is a Nobel Prize winner for that work, plus other work that he's done. He says that if it is proved, which is very strong words, that if effective discrimination occurs against Negroes, Black people, at all levels by whites, and we're seeing that that's effective at all levels, then the absolute and relative income of Black people declines continuously as discrimination increases. So the more discrimination you have, the less Black people are going to be able to earn and make. So we kind of have that context. The other thing that's important to note is that this wasn't like a short period of time. Sometimes, societies go through dark periods, right? And it's short and they kind of recover from it. Now, this wasn't a 3 or 5 year period. This lasted for about 75 years, right? Roughly from, 1870 to 1945. By the way, during which time 4,000 Black people are lynched, right? That's publicly executed by their fellow citizen. Nobody's been prosecuted for these things, right? So under those circumstances, you start to get the hint, right? Like no one is coming to save you. You get the hint, your family gets the hint, your church gets the hint, your community, right, gets the hint. So I think you can see that under that construct, you've got 100% tax on your labor. And if that's the case, then that is slavery by definition. And that's why they call this period slavery by another name, right? Now, if during the period of constitutional legal slavery, up to 50 trillion was extracted, and that's over 250 or so roughly years. And this is another 75, which is a third longer. And we got 4 million Black people roughly in the fields at that time. And even if you fast forward to 1935, you still have almost 4 million Black people still working in the fields. You can argue that during this period of time, an additional 15 trillion was extracted from these people and their descendants, right? So if you think about that, upon emancipation, that white planter class loses about $22 trillion worth of value. But then over the next 75 years or so, they would proceed to extract or claw back 15 trillion of that from those people and their descendants. Very difficult to accumulate wealth under these types of circumstances, right? So when you're thinking about Jim Crow, it's extraordinary. Now, you could make the argument that not everyone was under the Jim Crow regime. And that's a true statement. And that, some people did get an education, right? Even, during that time, a lot of periods of that time, someone like W.E.B. Du Bois went to Harvard, right, during that period of time. Now, one of the things that we need to understand from a context perspective is that coming from, emancipation, the desire was not to, educate Black people fully, right? There was certainly a push to expand public education. Smaller white farmers wanted that for their children, as they should. Newly freed people clearly wanted that for themselves and their children, as they should. That white planter class was not interested in that. Obviously, they used the private system to educate their children, but they did need the cooperation of the smaller white farmer. So they agreed to the expansion of public education with the intent of diverting resources from Black children to white children, right? So if you look at what Du Bois says, he says in the 40 years since emancipation, that Negro taxes and the Negro share of income from indirect taxes and endowments has fully repaid, right, the investment that was made in kind of Black education by white people during that period of time. He's just saying so little was invested that even the money that's put in by Black people directly and indirectly is equivalent to that. And these are people who have almost no economic resources. If you look at Thomas Logan, who is a kind of former Confederate general and industrialist, he shares kind of the mindset at the time, which is when the freedman regards himself qualified to earn a support by mental work using his intellectual prowess, that he is unwilling to accept manual labor, right? Why is this important? You know, if you look at what William Baldwin says in 1914, and he's president of the General Education Board, and you can think of that as like the Department of Education before the Department of Education. What he says is that the South needed Negroes educated so that they could be the best possible laborers, right? That was the right kind of education. They will willingly work menial jobs, and that will open up opportunities for Southern whites to work the more expert labor, right? So we see where this is going. If you go to 1917, there's about 64 public high schools for Black students across the South, not in a district, not in a state, but across that region, which is pretty extraordinary. And most of those are actually built and kind of owned by Black people. And as you can imagine of them, many are church houses or appendages, right, to churches. If you look at New York City during the 1920s, they're spending about 50 times more per child than South Carolina is spending on its Black children in a segregated school system there. 50. So if you think about that and you're an immigrant coming from Europe and you settle in that New York City area, 50 times more is being invested in your human capital development than a Black child is receiving in the segregated South, whose family has been there for literally hundreds of years. New York City at this time is not nearly as diverse as we kind of think and consider it now. It's about 97.1% white at that time. If you look in the South, for every dollar invested in a Black child, 5 to 8 are invested in a white child. There's no rocket science there. If you do that with your own children, one is going to be impoverished, right? And one is going to go to Harvard. Very difficult to accumulate wealth under these circumstances. Black teachers are earning 25 to 34 cents on the dollar for their white peer who's kind of teaching the same subjects. And if by the age of 25, white children are receiving 50% more years of education than their Black peers, right? So it's a massive underinvestment in human capital development for literally millions of Black children. So if we go back to Professor Becker, Gary Becker, and the economics of discrimination, his observation is that in the first half of the 20th century, that Negroes, Black people, have advanced little in the relative occupational hierarchy. So new opportunities to be a janitor, not a manager, and not a decision maker, not a higher skilled area, right? And that's over, approaching a 50-year period. And he says this, by the way, it's the same in the South as it is in the North, right? So this is a national issue in terms of how it's showing up in the workforce. This is so significant that researchers say if you kept the discrimination in the marketplace the same, but we had just invested equally in the children, that alone could have cut the earnings gap by about 50%, right? So when you think about that over millions of Black children across a generation, the opportunity cost, right, is massive, right? It's over $600 billion in today's equivalent. When you think about that over multiple generations and millions of children over roughly a 90-year period, going up to about 1954, kind of a Brown v. Board of Education type decision, we're talking about over $3 trillion of economic impact, right? So significant, very difficult to accumulate wealth, under these circumstances. So when you think about education, impact is significant, right? Now you can say, well, truth be told, back in those days, you didn't really need a super duper education to do well. Like we all have a story or an experience of a grandfather or a great grandfather that had like a 3rd grade education or maybe a 5th grade education, a tremendous work ethic, right? eventually, owned a home or built a home and did well, right, by himself and his family. So, and home ownership really was the key thing, right? And you'd be correct. Like home ownership is the great wealth builder, right? And it's extremely important to the country. It's actually part of the American dream, as we all know about it. And this is not kind of idle language. The country has invested heavily in helping to create what we now know is this thing called the property middle class, which really never existed like previously anywhere. So and the investments were massive, right? So we're talking about $120 billion at that time. So over $1 trillion in today's equivalent now, right? So a serious, sustained commitment to home ownership, amongst the citizens. The challenge is that less than 2% of that went to Black Americans, right? But for over 20 million Europeans who came to the United States, and after they naturalized, became citizens, they had access to all these resources. Now, I'm not going to go into like redlining because I'm sure you guys are familiar with that, but it's safe to say that the federal government created the mortgage as we know it. They basically guaranteed or underwrote payments of citizens that reduced the risk, that allowed banks to take lower down payments. That's where the 20% comes from. To repay the loan over a longer period of time, that's where the 30-year repayment comes from. And to have interest rates that are lower and more affordable and reflect the new limited risk associated with that. It's a wonderful thing, right? However, they did not do that, guarantee loans, for Black citizens, and certainly not for Black citizens who were interested in moving into better resourced white communities. Now, the financial institutions, the banks followed suit with that. You wanted to go directly to the developer, you would not be able to do that. The developers also followed suit. Real estate agents wouldn't participate in those types of transactions for the most part. And even citizens signed agreements among themselves that said, hey, if you sell from here, this community, you promise to sell to someone who's, either white or Caucasian or European kind of, ancestry. So you've got a total kind of wall, right? That's preventing you from really participating in one of the, largest, most virulent wealth creation engines, right, that the world has ever seen. That sounds all qualitative, but what we can say in a very, very concrete way is that between the late 20s, right, and the 60s, that less than 1% of all mortgages in the country went to Black Americans. Not 1%, less than 1%, right? So you're talking about almost a complete and total shutout of being able to participate in one of the greatest wealth creation vehicles that the world, has ever seen. Now, as you know full well, just because you're not a recipient of this kind of guarantee that other people are receiving, it doesn't mean that you don't want to be a homeowner. Of course, you still want to be a homeowner. So what people did is they started to pivot and look at the private markets under a construct called contract sales, right? Now, these private markets are unregulated. So there's no appraisals required. So homes are selling at 2x the price, right? You've got draconian interest rates. But here's like the worst thing. As you're making your payments, you're not accruing any equity in the house. And by the way, you're liable for all the repairs and maintenance associated with it. So what I mean by that is if we agree that I'm gonna make 100 installment payments and then I take possession of the home, right? And I do 99 of those on time, but I missed the 100, you get to keep my 99 payments, keep my down payments, evict me from the house, resell it to someone else, and I've earned no equity, right, in that house. Again, extremely difficult, right, to accumulate wealth under those circumstances. Now, the researchers say that if you go to the 1950s, in that greater Chicagoland area, which is a huge area for migration of Black people fleeing the tyranny of the South, that in the 50s, up to 85% of all real estate transactions for Black people happened under contract sales. Extremely difficult to accumulate wealth under those circumstances. Now, if you say, well, just kind of hunker down and save what you can, these things will pass, you've got some interesting dynamics happening in these communities. It turns out that rents in these Black urban communities is more than 50% higher outside of them. Intuitively, this doesn't make any sense, right? Why would rent in a less desirable area be higher in a more desirable area. And here's what we have to remember. There are literally millions of people fleeing the tyranny of the South, right? Over 6 million people. And they are not able to move into better resource white communities. They're being corralled in these inner cities, right? And what happens when the demand for housing rises faster than the availability of housing? The price goes up. So that's what you start to see in these communities. Again, difficult to accumulate wealth and to save under these circumstances. If you go to 1968, the Federal Trade Commission did a study, and they found from that study that goods and services in those communities are selling at 3 times the price as the same goods and services outside of those communities, 3x the price. Again, very difficult, right, to be able to accumulate wealth under these types of circumstances. And if you say, well, just keep your head down and work hard, these things will pass, right? And if you look at discrimination in the labor market, the estimates are from the late 20s into the early 60s that it's about $1.6 trillion of discrimination that Black people are feeling within the labor market. By the way, that's in 1983 dollars, right? So if you bring that forward, it's over $4 trillion in today's equivalent. This is part of the reason why it's been so difficult to be able to actually close these wealth gaps. So if you look at the work of the following economists from University of Bonn and the New York Fed, they looked at wealth and income equality since World War II up into the present, kind of that 7-year period. And what they found was no progress was made, right, during that period of time. These gaps were not closed over that period of time. What I'm trying to provide is a little bit of context as to why it would be so difficult to be able to close, right, those gaps. Now, so if you look at the impact from housing, it's extraordinary. If you look at the impact from labor market discrimination, it's extraordinary. It's in the trillions, right, of dollars. Now, there is also the impact of the New Deal. There is the GI Bill, right? Those investments are over $1 trillion in equipment. There is equivalent in today. There is the interstate highway construction, which was massive in today's equivalent. And then there is what is the economic cost of discrimination post-civil rights area up until the present, also extraordinary. I won't have time to go through all those things right now, but those things are covered in the book. Shameless plug, right? So you will absolutely love that. But what I do want to talk to you about a little bit is kind of where are we now, right? And if you look at the most fundamental level, the Black community is missing about $1.5 trillion of income. $1 trillion of that is associated with business infrastructure that is not present, and $500 billion is associated with unemployment, underemployment, and the like. We've already spoken about the wealth gap, which is about $14 trillion. How do you arrive at that? Mean household income for difference between white and Black families is $841,000 times about 17 million Black families gets you to that number, right? That's just a quantification of a number that people keep kind of talking about without saying how large it actually is. And then we talked about the missing jobs and businesses, right, with employees. One of the things that I saw as I was doing the research, this number that kept coming up again and again and again, right, as I was doing this research, was this 2% number. So it seemed like this 2% rule or a real paradigm to me. It was like areas that are really critical for wealth accumulation for Black people, you tend to be at this participation rate of around 2%. So if you look at like corporate supply chain spend, which is massive, it's typically less than 2% for Black enterprise. This is not a minority number, right? This is for Black enterprise. If you look at government supply chain spend at all levels, federal, state, and local, it's like less than 2% for Black enterprise. If you look at even the money that Black people are spending on Black enterprise, right? It's like 2% of the total spend. If you think about almost all high growth, high compensation areas, you tend to have a 2% participation rate, right? Even SBA lending, right? For small businesses, it's less than 2%. I see the number is 1.6%. And if you think about, capital that's used for business formation, whether it's, venture capital, angel, friends and family, personal capital, right? Again, you're at less than 2%. So this puts a real, negative, depressive pressure and impact on business formation, business development, and job creation, right, across the Black community. Now, one of the things I want to kind of end with and talk with you guys about is this question that I got when I did my first talk at Google. And it was like, Sean, we have a better understanding of the economic cost of discrimination for Black people during this time period. But could you also tell us about what the cost has been for the country? And I thought that was a brilliant question, right? And I didn't have the answer at the time. And I told him I didn't have the answer, but I would think about it. And I was fortunate to be asked to come back and to speak with them. And I answered the question in this way. And I want to share that, with you guys, which is, what if Black Americans have been allowed to fully participate in the innovation system that drove the economy, right? So let's talk about this. Why is this so important? This time period that I've been talking about, I spent a lot of time on, right? It's kind of Jim Crow type period. As draconian as it is, it's also one of the most innovative periods in the Industrial Revolution, right? You have, during this period, you have over 2.5 million patents are created. You've got the telephone, the light bulb, motion pictures, airplanes, automobiles, you've got transistors. All of the tech industry is based on this semiconductor technology that allows, signal to go from chip to chip, so on and so forth, right? All these amazing things are happening at that time. How much of those 2.5 million patents are coming from Black people? The answer is 726. Not zero, but effectively zero on a number as large as 2.5 million. You're talking about almost a total and complete shutout, right? Now, why is this important? So we look at what Professor Kortum from Yale is saying. He says a constant flow of new patents can generate a constant rate of economic growth. This is empirical. This is in the data. You can go look it up over the last 150 years, right, or so, right? The other thing that's important to understand is from the Brookings Institute, they're saying that the nation's unequal access to high quality schooling deprives the innovation system of a number of folks who might otherwise make or commercialize important discoveries, right? So, and something else that I think is really important that we all understand is that talent, skill, capability follows a normal distribution or a Gaussian spread. Just a fancy way of saying 70% of people tend to be in the middle, right? 15% tend to be substantially above. I call that group the ultra brilliant. And we all like to think we're part of that group, right? And then 15% are substantially below. So a question that I had is, what is the size of that ultra brilliant population for Black people during this continuum that we're talking about, right? And what were those people doing? So if you go back to 1870, the size of that 15%, not the total population of Black people, just that 15% of ultra brilliant, is over 700,000 people. If you fast forward to 1900, it's over 3 million. It's over 1.3 million. You fast forward to 1930, it's almost 1.8. If you get to 1950, it's almost 2.3, right? When you're in 1870 and 1900, 1930, what are those people doing? How is that brilliance being employed, right? A large number of those people are engaged in forms of sharecropping, tenant farming, and all kinds of domestic type work. A massive underutilization of talent. Even when you fast forward to around 1950, only about 1.6% of Black people even have college degrees, right, at that time. So what is the impact of that, right? Like, what if those people had actually been a critical part of that innovation system? Well, one, we would have seen another 280,000 patents created, not 726, right? That would have led to an incremental improvement in GDP of about $2 trillion per year, right? Now, McKinsey and Company has done their own work, and they've already said that if you close the wealth gap, it would generate $1.5 trillion per year, every year, on a go-forward basis, right? And then from a wealth perspective, the nation would be looking at over $9 trillion more in wealth, right? Now, there's a professor from Michigan State University that did some really interesting research. And she kind of posed this question, which is, what if white Americans had experienced the level of trauma that Black Americans had experienced in that period of time? What would have happened specifically to innovation, right? And to patent creation and the like. And her estimates state that 40% of the patents would have never been created. Think about this. Which 40% of these things can we actually do or live without? And what would have been the economic impact on the country of that? From a wealth perspective, right? We'd have had 1 million less patents, that's 40% less. They had almost 8 trillion less of GDP, right? And the nation would be, the national wealth would be over $30 trillion less than what it is now, right? So the point here is that the cost clearly has been massive for Black people in America. And in addition to that, there is also a massive cost for the country as a whole. In fact, Gary Becker states in Economic Discrimination that both parties engage in discrimination, both the discriminator and the discriminated, pay an economic price for that action. The price, of course, is proportional to the capital difference between the two. We've seen what the enormous price has been for Black people and get a sense of what the enormous price has been for the country as a whole, right? So as you take out and you reduce discrimination, the pie is actually bigger for everyone. Now I want to share, kind of end with 2 quotes. One is from Albert Einstein, and he says that the worst disease under which the society of our nation suffers, in his opinion, is the treatment of the Negro. You can see from an economic perspective why he would come to that conclusion. By the way, he was a huge advocate for Black people, right? Which many people are surprised about. He was not silent on these matters at all. And then, of course, from Emperor Selassie from Ethiopia, in his address to United Nations back in 1963, he said the basis for racial discrimination has been economic. And it is with economics that these evils can be overcome. And I totally agree with that statement. That being said, I'm going to pause. We can talk a little bit about the PhD economic framework, about solutions, the importance of specificity, kind of answer any questions that you guys may have. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sean. I'm kind of the voice of all the other folks who are listening in and saying we appreciate it. One of the things that I've noticed, and I've told people, is your book it's not long, but it takes a while to read it. Because just like the presentation, there's a lot of information that is given. And for some people who knew some of these things, there is they feel the weight of the new things. And for folks who maybe haven't thought so much about this, it feels like it's a lot. And so the question, I guess, is the first one is with all the history that you have presented, I know we'll talk about this more in the next session as well, but the purchase, hire, deposit, the PhD model. I mean, we are fixers, or my wife tells me I'm a fixer. I want to fix problems. So could you speak a little bit more on PhD and what that looks like?
Absolutely. So PhD is an economic framework, right? So what it literally stands for is purchase, hire. I'm big on acronyms, as you guys can see, right? They're easy to remember, and it can be very powerful. So it stands for purchase, hire, and deposit in ways that create jobs, create and expand business, and provide capital in the Black community, right? The reason that's important is because those are the 3 primary gaps that are driving almost all these socioeconomic problems, right? The gap in jobs, the gaps in businesses or business infrastructure, and capital affordability and availability. We simply can't have the thriving ecosystems and communities that we want with gaps, right, that are large underpinning those things, right? So the idea is the policies, plans, and programs that we put in place need to be stimulative for job creation, business development, capital availability, and affordability within the Black community, right? In particular, that's where these gaps are. So it's like if you say purchase for an individual, that's just how we spend our money, right? We have a supply chain. There's stuff that we buy to be able to, execute our lives. And it's to encourage people to do more business with Black enterprise and Black, professionals. So when you think about, people who would, buy a home, for example, right? If they're so blessed and fortunate to be in that position, is there a Black realtor engaged, right? We all have to pay those transaction fees. Nobody's excited about it, right? But you have a large disengagement or non-inclusion of kind of Black realtors within that process, both inside and outside of the Black community. When you think about converting that house into a home, who's the general contractor that you're working with, right? Who are these high quality craftspeople that you're working with in terms of, you know, plumbing and HVAC and flooring, drywalling, electrical, right? Roofing, all of these kind of tremendous skills that will never be offshored, right? When we're thinking about, you know, who are our financial planners or wealth advisors or attorneys that we use, right? Do we include kind of Black enterprise in those processes? That's just from an individual perspective. If you look at it from a corporation or an institution perspective, that's your supply chain, right? To what extent are people doing business with Black enterprise? Because that can be stimulative for the creations of tens of thousands of jobs, right? And the base of inclusion right now is so small that small shifts in that can have dramatic and significant economic impacts, right? So the P can really be powerful just as an individual basis, from a family perspective, or from the context of corporations or institutions or governments, our political representatives, right? The biggest consumer in the whole world, I think, is certainly in the whole country, but probably in the whole world, federal government, right? So are you part of that supply chain? Participation rate currently is extraordinarily small. And the higher is, are you properly represented on payrolls across meaningful levels, right? And to really get to that, you got to look more at specificity, because you have kind of general programs that are supposed to have impact on Black populations that may or may not. And then the deposits are, how do we leverage our balance sheets, our personal, our corporate and institutional balance sheets, by making deposits in financial institutions that provide loans and credit and liquidity, and in Black communities, that's Black banks, federal, whether it's credit unions or CDFIs, community development financial institutions, or it's community banks that are forward facing and kind of lending into those communities. So where do we put our deposits? Where do our large institutions put their deposits, governments, companies? We're starting to see some action being taken in that respect. You know, Netflix made a commitment to use a certain portion of their available cash and to put it into kind of Black financial institutions. So those things can be really powerful, like who's managing your pension fund in terms of allocating resources to those private equity folks who may be kind of Black owned or Black led, who can buy companies that can now supply back into your supply chain. So that's kind of the construct of this PhD. It's got to be economic, it's got to be scalable, right? And it's got to, you know, have substance, right? As opposed to style.
And you're talking, you referenced something just there about halfway through about the importance of specificity. Mm-hmm. And if you could share a little bit more about that, does that mean, is specificity akin to intentionality, or is it something else that's going on?
Yeah, so great question, right? So it's both. Specificity follows intentional nature. So what happens is, it's important for people to understand, and I say this everywhere I go, that minority, diverse, inclusive does not mean Black, right? So what it tends to be is euphemisms for not white male. Now, if you ask yourself, who is that? You're describing 90% of people on planet Earth, right? It's a massive group, it's incredibly broad and general for really specific problems. So I can give you some kind of concrete examples, right? So let's say we said, you know what, in our supply chains, we want to do more business with women-owned businesses and the larger ones that are large enough to have employees, right? I think that's a phenomenal idea. Double, triple, quadruple down on that. How much revenue do they drive? They drive about $1.2 trillion in revenue, which is great. Now, if you ask yourself, how much of that is coming from Black women within that group? It's less than 2%, right? So for every $100 you're investing into that program, it's not until the $99th dollar that you're landing on a Black enterprise, right? Now, if you say the same thing about our Latino brothers and sisters, like, let's do more business with them. I say, fantastic. Double, triple, quadruple down on it. and do business with those that are of the size where they have employees. Terrific. You ask yourself, how much revenue are they driving? It's about $380 billion, right, per year. If you say how much of that is from Black people within that group, it's less than 2%. So you got that same dynamic that for every $100 you're putting in, again, it's not until the $99 that a Black enterprise within that group is being hit. And then if you say, let's do the same thing with our Asian brothers and sisters, I'm like, great, sounds great, double, triple, quadruple down on it. They're driving about $628 billion of revenue. No Black people in there by definition. So now if I add up that whole diverse group and I say what percentage of that is from Black enterprise, it's 4%, right? So even though you have the great intention of doing this minority, diverse, inclusive type work, it's like filling a swimming pool to get a glass of water for Black people, right? That doesn't make sense. That's incredibly dilutive. But the feeling is that it's going to Black people, right? But the economic benefit is not going to Black people. And then after you spend that money, you look around and say, well, why are these folks in the same situation, right? And because you don't have the specificity that's going with it. And by the way, this is not a revolutionary thought. This is fundamental to problem solving, right? But like we do this every single day in every problem that we work on, right? If we see that the problem is here, we don't go solve a different problem, right? And then say we've done it for this particular problem. So, but things kind of get hazy when you start focusing on kind of Black related things. And part of the challenge is that Black often is interpreted like it's almost like it's offensive to some people, right? So you say something needs to be Black. It's like, whoa, 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 don't make it racial. You know what I mean? It's like, I didn't make it anything. You interpreted it in that way. So then people start to learn to come up with things that are more acceptable. So instead of Black, it's got to be minority, right? It's diverse, it's inclusive. It's all these kind of other words to kind of get around saying that. Problem with all of that, nomenclature is very important. The words you use are very important because policy follows that wording and capital flows according to policy. So if you get these generalized kind of characterizations of a very specific group, you're going to get policy that's generalized and you're going to get resources that flow in a generalized way. If you look around, you start seeing that, right, all over the place. So that's why you got to be specific. Because we know when programs are specific and targeted, well designed and well capitalized and executed, that they have significant benefits.
That's incredibly, again, helpful and humbling as well, because it goes back to even in those things, that 2% or that less than 2% rule, which we keep coming back to, which keeps as a theme throughout the a lot of your analysis of the data there. I'm going to toss it to Patrick for a question or two, and then I'll come back. Oh, and Patrick, we can't hear you.
Patrick, we can't hear you.
This mute, can you hear me now?
I hear you now.
Can you hear me now? All right. Well, I just want to say this aspect of 2%, it seems like it's always in every area. I'm actually going to a question and kind of to go back to the specificity that you just noted. Someone asked, when you think about companies like Google, you think about companies, IBM, you think about companies that you spoke to in the past, what have you stated to them about being specific in what they can do in this battle of the Black tax?
Yeah, so I've worked at IBM for a number of years, right? I haven't spoken at IBM as yet, but I have spoken at Google. I spoke there, twice. And what you start to see, and they heard principally, same kind of conversation, right? Is you had a lot of people talking about like, what do we do to affect change, right? And one of those things were like, what are these Black banks? Because people had no idea. They didn't even know it was such a thing, right? And how do we put our money in those banks? This was the conversation that's happening. And more importantly, how did we get Google to put its money in Black banks? And by the way, these conversations are pre George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, pandemic, all of this kind of energy that's happening now where people are trying to educate themselves more. You had that kind of energy and discussion, right? And what are you seeing Google do now, right? They're allocating resources to place into areas or people who focus on Black enterprise. They're putting money in CDFIs, right? They're kind of taking these actions, right? You can see like a place like Amazon, right? They're trying to, they had a pretty robust showing in terms of on their website on directing people to Black businesses, Black products, kind of really highlighting Black History Month, and all these kinds of things. You've got like a Netflix that is saying we're going to allocate resources, right, from our balance sheet, available cash, and put it in these institutions so they can lend out more. You've got, JP Morgan Chase, where I've spoken at, and they're actually a leader in specificity, quite frankly, right? They're the only company that I was aware of that actually was specific. They actually created a plan called Advancing Black Pathways, right? And that was pre-George Floyd also. And they've made like a $30 billion commitment. Now that's not for Black people exclusively, right? But that is to direct in those, areas. They put $200 million into an alternative investment fund along with Ariel Capital Management, which is a Black firm, so that they can go out and buy businesses of massive size and scale that can now kind of supply into many different kind of corporations. So you've got some companies that are actually kind of making these moves and trying to do so in a more specific and a more substantial case, but the vast majority are not doing that. There's a lot of generalized action that's very dilutive.
Well, I guess another follow-up that I would think about, I've heard some individuals say, well, I see these things happening in the metropolitan city, but I don't see this happening in the rural city. That everything you told me was about something in the past. What would you say in aspect of looking at what is the Black tax now if you were visualizing the metropolitan city versus the rural city? And how could you make a difference in those communities?
Yeah, I think the first part, economically, there's not a whole lot of difference, right? I mean, you can go to New York City, it's incredibly diverse, but if you look at their supply chain spend, it's like less than 1% is going to Black enterprise. What you have is a lot of talk about what's being happening for minority and diverse and inclusive and all this kind of stuff. But people don't disaggregate the numbers for Black enterprise because they tend to be abysmal, right? So that's a massive city. It's progressive, there's diversity, there's lots of things that are kind of going on. But I just drill down to the economics, right? Either you're driving jobs, business capital in a Black community, right? Either you are creating and expanding businesses, either you're creating opportunity for new jobs, or you're not. So you start to see economically, you got a similar kind of spread, when it comes to other rural areas, right? It might even be more exacerbated, right, in certain areas. When you look at government supply chain spend, right, it's extraordinarily limited, right? Now, what I think is really, really critical is people have really strong positions, very passionate about those positions. Those positions often lack context, they lack information, right? And as people get access to context and information, some people see things in a new way and in a new light. And they start to ask questions about what can you do. So you first have to provide people with the opportunity to get access to it, right? So, and that's whether it's rural or whether it's in the city, right? The issue is, will more or less people self-select into getting exposed to that information or not, right? And statistically, I wouldn't be able to kind of comment on that. But the solution is first is you need a paradigm shift, right? It's as a problem solver and a strategist, it doesn't make sense to provide solutions to people who don't see the problem. That is a very costly, time-consuming, limited, effective way of moving forward, right? So the first thing, and because we want people to take a new set of actions, new actions always follows new thinking. That's why that initial paradigm shift is so important, right? To be able to see things differently, right? Now you see the need to act differently. And then the other piece of it is I know that the enormity of the problem, right, is very large. And I want to help people to understand you're under no obligation to try to convince everybody of everything, right? Resources, policy creation, policy execution, that is not distributed equally. There's a smaller group of people that have a greater ability to affect change than others, right? There are people who are open to solving these problems, like work with those folks and try to get the maximum impact. We're not trying to boil the ocean, and you do not need everyone. Most people are not path setters. They're not, most people are not path finders or path creators. And no, this is no disrespect to anybody. Most people are path followers, right? What we have to do is to create a new path that is economically stimulative for people to follow. And then they can see empirically over time that it does work, right? And you work with those folks. And that's what you do. We tend to have this desire to focus on the intransigent. Cannot do that. We have limited time, we have limited resources. Any moment you're spending with them is less time you're spending with somebody who's excited to do something right now.
Well, I know as you're answering questions and I'm watching the ticker go up with new questions. Dave, I'm going to turn it over to you. Maybe you already have one queued up, and I'll look at the other question.
I have 7 queued up, but I will ask one right now. So, and kind of what you're talking about right there, the question that had kind of come up in our Wednesday night discussion of this book is, and you kind of talked, Simon Sinek talks a little about early adopters and talks about starting with why, and how do you get that kind of transformative thing going. One thing you mentioned earlier under effective solutions is 2 things. One was empathy and the other one was understanding. And when I heard that, what I heard was hearts and minds, right? So empathy has to do with hearts. It is the connection, the possibility for transformation. I'm sure there's somebody who has been had you have eureka moments in math class with numbers, but a lot of times it comes through personal stories, that kind of thing. And so I guess if there's any advice or any counsel on how do we best ways forward or best practices to do this, because clearly there's some things that you're talking about. There's private industry, and then there's legislative, and then there's judicial things, and that feels just like the weight of the world right there when that gets mentioned. What are some suggestions on that hearts and minds questions on a small scale that you would have for us?
Yeah, so the first step is you got to engage in conversations like this one to facilitate the paradigm shift. Right now, there's a hyper focus on people being affirmed. So they have positions and they're seeking the information that solidify those positions, right? Where we really need to be informed so we can be transformed, right? There's no shortcutting that. We've got to have these types of conversations that we're having now. People have to be exposed to it. Why is that? Because we're going to naturally want to resolve the cognitive dissonance. You believe something, you know something, it's what you've been told your whole life. You're kind of seeing it, the media is feeding it into you, and then you hear something that's somewhat different, and you got to resolve that, right? So we're going to find ways to continue to resolve that dissonance, right? The point of the book and where it's laid out in the talks are, once you see, you can't unsee, right? Once, this isn't a data point. What people do is that they have something that occurred at some point in time that's tragic and qualitative. First thing, qualitative impacts have less impact than people think, right? Because we can have lots of qualitative conversations and we can always walk away agreeing to disagree. It's very different when you put it in concrete terms, because the math is the same in my office as it is in your office, right? The other thing is we have to add context to things. What happened before that period? What happened after that period? So you can see both the cumulative and longitudinal effect, right? So you're like, my goodness, like this is not what I understood. Like this thing was kind of like never ending. It's kind of changing form, right? But you're having this kind of continuous effect. And what that does is it disaggregates the individual from the environment. Remember, we live under a context where it's about rugged individualism. The vast determinant outcomes for people is your environment. It's the richness of opportunities in your environment, right? If you come from an area that's highly impoverished, high rates of concentrated poverty, lots of your outcomes are predetermined. It's 99% less likely that you are going to graduate with a 4-year degree. That's a race independent. It just so happens Black people are 10 times more exposed to that than anything else, right? That's what this information does, because if you can see that the impact of the environment, and these people didn't self-select this environment, then I think you not only want to be part of the solution, but you want to be part of the solution in a different way. Because if you think it's the fault of the individual, the best you're going to get is kind of like, well, it's triage. How do I help these folks who can't seem to help themselves stop kind of fumbling the ball?
Yeah.
Versus transformation, which is, but for XYZ circumstances, that could have been me, which is why I laid that out. There's no MacGyver Hollywood version of this where you parachute into this Jim Crow structure. And if it were you, there would have been a different outcome, right? They thought deeply about this stuff, right? It was elegantly designed. It was nefarious, right? And intentional and really hermetically sealed, right? To deliver kind of these outcomes. That allows you to get not only empathize, but get past the triage, right? And get into how do we actually affect change? And that's the hard part, right?
And I appreciate that. In fact, the questions of charity versus justice, the questions about, St. Mark folks, if in the next few weeks you hear a sermon that has the words confirmed, informed, and transformed in it, it will be completely stolen from this conversation right here. Patrick, if you'd allow me one more question, because it kind of ties to that about where you get about the environment. And we've had a lot of questions about education. There are a lot of questions in St. Louis. There's questions about equity in education. The questions about, my wife teaches at a local high school where kids sometimes have to go 2 hours in the bus to get there. They're coming down to the city. And then also the question about charter schools as well has been brought up. So if you could speak a little bit about kind of that environment, or where it is in perhaps what work is there to do that we could look at.
Yes, so my education and environment in general, and education in particular, these are enormous questions, right? By the way, all of this is resolvable, right? That doesn't mean we don't respect the enormity of it and the scale of it, but it's resolvable. I won't be able to do the education piece of it as much justice, right? Because education is funded by the wealth in the community as it pertains to home values, right? And property taxes associated with that. So you have a vast difference in resources that are allocated to children who come from different environments. And Black communities were formed by exclusion and deprivation. The idea of expecting the same level of excellence coming out of communities that have 200 times less resource doesn't even make logical sense, right? So we have to deal with the underlying issues. Again, by the way, that goes back to the jobs business capital. You go to all of these terrific tier 1 educational school systems, guess what they don't lack? Jobs business capital, right? These other places that are struggling, guess what they do lack, right? So it's getting to a lower level of abstraction. We got to solve those issues because that's the infrastructure. The education is a superstructure on top of a very weak infrastructure, right? The other piece of it is what I advocate for, while we're solving this much bigger problem that I would not have enough time to do justice with, is we have a massive underrepresentation of Black teachers in front of Black students. We're actually missing 350,000 Black teachers, proportional to the number of Black students in the K-12 system. Now, I go the step further and say, what is the economic impact of that? That's $20 billion a year of salary and benefits not going to those teachers and not going to the Black community because of that. By the way, those are pillars of the community. One of the greatest things you could do is come from a family of educators. We all know that, right? That's a huge gift and blessing because they don't play around, right? If you look at the backstory of lots of amazing people, they come from like families of educators. These folks are consumers. They're going to be buying homes. They're going to be interacting with businesses and iPhones and all the other things that we have. You got that gigantic group that's missing. Yeah. You also have high levels of anti-Black bias, which I cover in the book and we don't have to go into right now, but that plays out in expectation levels that are set for kids. And the data says that non-Black teachers have 40% lower expectation levels. Now, when you think about the fact that young people rise or fall relative to the expectations that are set in them, we think about our own households. Can't speak to for everyone else, but it's not a democracy, right? Our household, you will do well, and we're going to do everything in the whole world to make sure that you can do well, right? So if there's an impediment, we're very, very fortunate to be able to allocate resources to take some of those things out the way, but expectation is actually quite high. So you got more kids who are subjected to like lower expectations. That is problematic. You have more kids who the work product of Black people is actually interpreted differently, which is another thing to discuss and take a look at that applies to children too. And the presence of disruptive behavior, even when that doesn't exist, is seen in Black children. By the way, down to a pre-K level. Mm-hmm. The cutest little humans you could ever imagine running around doing all their stuff, you can see disruptive behavior and like little Black babies kind of running around where nobody's exhibiting it, right? These things are problematic of this massive kind of underrepresentation. And in the book, I talk about how this came to be. Because at one point, there was a Black teacher for every Black student, right, in the country. And now you have this massive kind of gap. So while we're resolving all these issues, we need to get those teachers hired, we need to get them in place. Because not only you affecting these other issues, it's a gigantic economic issues as well.
Thank you.
I wanted to make sure I know that we were trying to do a hard stop at 8 o'clock and we have 1 minute, and I'm thinking of all of the questions here. And I'm trying to figure out a way to almost combine 3 questions. So first I will say, Sean, I really wanted you to go into some dialogue. And I think you've done it a little bit in the aspect of thinking about explicit versus implicit bias. But I think the way I'll combine this question, it may even tie into some of that. I had one question where it says, it seems like this country's economy flourished based on slave labor and what needs to change. But also in the same context, was stated, and I'm scrolling to that question. We believe that the church will lead the change and bridge the gap of wealth gap in this area. What can the majority white church? And then I'll combine that to say, someone else said, if I'm white, why should I care? Why should I care about this? But they said, what can we as a church, but also think about the majority white church who benefited greatly from the aspect of what you've shared today. What can we do to bridge that gap with the Black church so that society sees that we model that we're trying to bridge that gap? You with me, Sean?
Yeah, there's a lot in that, right? So
all right,
you'll have to bring me back to different aspects of it. In terms of what the church can do, is no different. You have to do PhD. There's the amplification of the message, and there's taking the actual actions and being seen as a representative, right, of this kind of actions. But when you start thinking about how is the church utilizing PhD in terms of how does it even before it goes anyplace else? How do you leverage your balance sheet? Who are you doing business with? Who are you getting liquidity from to build the edifices, right? What general contractors, what architects, what craftspeople, right? Like there's a tremendous amount of infrastructure that's put in place. There's a tremendous maintenance of that infrastructure that puts in place. There are lots of people that are employed, right? Kind of in this across both the Black and the white church. Like how is PhD being exemplified there from an economic perspective? And so in that respect, there's no difference. The power here is that the church touches almost everybody, right? Like, which is powerful. Like the ability to affect change is unreal. Even if you kind of you start with the Black church, right? 84% of Black people are self-professed Christians, right? Like that's a huge connection point, right? And then when you go into the white church, you have massive economic base, right? People control 90% of all economic resources in the country. People who sit in the pews own companies, right? Influence institutions. They can affect PhD. They don't actually need any government help to do it. When it's your company or your institution is under your control, you can just do it. Now, by the way, it's advantageously economically beneficial to you. That's the point that I'm trying to make for the person who's like, why do I care? Like, if you don't care about the human aspect of this, and by the way, I could walk you through the horror of this. I just chose not to, right? And you have a rough time sleeping if I kind of walk you through that. But if you cared nothing about the humanitarian aspect of it, and you only cared about the financial aspect of it, the great thing is there's money in it for you. Your companies will actually perform better. The data says that these so-called diverse teams outperform these hyper-homogeneous teams. Why is that? Because they're including the brilliance of formerly excluded populations, and you're not. What you're doing is actually detrimental to shareholder value, and you don't know it. And I'm not blaming anyone for it, because the ideology that they grew up with was that it was zero sum, right? It's either me or you. And by the way, the other ideology was that there is an inferiority associated with Black people, and that resonance is still there. And there's all kinds of hyper negative things, right? You gotta remember, like, people blew people's houses up when they tried to move into like communities, like, you know what I mean? And this wasn't like outlier stuff. This happened at scale, right? Why is that? So if you only care about the money, the great thing is there's money in it for you, right? If you care about the money and the humanitarian aspect, then you see why it's so necessary. There's one thing of dealing with people who kind of brought it under themselves, which is the general backdrop in thinking, right? So can the church play an enormous role? Absolutely. The people sitting in the pews control a massive amount of the resources across the entire country. They can affect enormous change, right? Like when Jamie Dimon decided that, you know, the inclusion of more executives, because Black people weren't getting the opportunity. They had talent, but you got to be identified and put in the right places, and then people need to kind of mentor you and all this kind of stuff, and then you can kind of show your stuff. You know, when he decided to do that, you just need to make sure the shareholders agree. They're the ultimate beneficiaries of it. Then they decided to do it. You didn't need government permission to do it, right? You can kind of take action. So you have action that we can take in the Black church, and then you have action on a multiple impact, right? That can be taken within the white church to be able to help resolve these problems.
Well, Sean, I don't want to get on the sermon, but I just think about the idea of almost PTSD when you think about the trauma, but then we're talking about just the economic aspect. If we were just stating that we're the church and we're the light or the beacon on the hill, we would worry about the humanity aspect, but also the economic aspect, because we're good stewards. We should be stewards of what he has provided us. So again, I could go on and on in this conversation, but I want to make sure that I prepare us for the next step. Ultimately, we want this to grow into action. We want this to be a next step, an aspect that we, as I would say, meditate on this information. And I would say, as an African-American man, I have no problem saying that I can feel the trauma of just listening to the quantification of the dollar aspect of what I may have seen in the past, but also what I'm looking at now in the present. The key is, what can we do right now? And that's one of the things that we want everyone here to think about. April 8th, we're going to talk about, how do we engage with this information? How do we move forward with this information? Just as we're talking about, what can we do as a church? How can we be the example? And then how can we take that out into the world? That idea of just looking at the Black tax, and again, just take some time. If you haven't had a chance to read, and as Dave said earlier, let's see here. It's a short book, but you tend to read and meditate on that thought process of what was actually being experienced. So again, I'm excited for the next step, and I'm excited for the change that we will make as a church, but also as people, just an aspect of what we can possibly do. Dave, I'm going to pass it to you. Yeah. Anything you want to add on that?
Just a thanks to Sean for his time and for his engagement and answering the questions. Like I said, we have some additional questions that we'll certainly, if it wasn't answered tonight, we'll certainly make sure to address this in April. Folks are invited, if you'd like to. We have 2 more weeks on Wednesday nights to be part of a conversation with this, and you're welcome to join us. All you have to do is contact me. I'll make sure to get you the information. And we're just looking forward to the next conversation and the next step. Thanks to Kathleen as well, and for her tech work behind the scenes. And just pray God's blessing on the rest of you as we begin our third week of Lent and our journey towards. We are people who believe in resurrection, and we're people who believe in transformation. And if we think this problem's bigger than what we can handle, then we need to think about how big our God is as well. And a reminder, our God says, "Come follow," and I'm gonna do wonderful things through you. So keep that faith and keep learning, and let's look at this transformation. So anything else you'd like to ask Sean before we leave?
Yeah, I encourage everyone to read the book, right, themselves, get access to the information. There's a ton of work that's been done to really consolidate lots of disparate information into a really kind of powerful, longitudinal, cumulative story. It's executized, which you will love, right? I'm not a person I could always deliver what was necessary in much shorter space than what people would like, typically. So there's nothing in the book that's not supported by data from research from the institutions all around the country. It's a quick read. It's a powerful read. It's a profound read. It is not an opinion piece, and it is not a series of qualitative statements that are unsubstantiated, right? If you're an audiobook lover, it's available on Audible for all my audiobook people. If you love to read it in your Kindle, it's also available, in Kindle, right? So you guys will appreciate that. It's available on our website as well, which is www.blacktax.com. And the work and myself was featured on Amazon also for Black History Month as a history maker. So they appreciate the work as well. So again, to be informed to become transformed, right? We want to set the foundation, and this does a lot to do that.
Well, yeah. Go ahead, Patrick.
I was gonna say, everyone, go home and do your homework. I just want, as I wrote down, what actions or efforts would you recommend in making a difference for transformation to eliminate the Black tax? How would you get involved in your community and abroad? These are things that we hope that you're going to take this time to dive into this material and see where God is calling you to make a difference. So Dave, I got to pass it back to you.
All right. So here's my last thing I'll say. I'll give a benediction, a blessing. Just go out into the world. May your eyes be open. Reading this book is open your eyes. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. But when you see it, you're seeing it with, we trust we're seeing what God's seeing too. And that's sometimes a hard thing. It's a difficult thing, but it is a road that we do not walk alone. So may you know and feel God's blessing with you. And so until that next time, wish you all a good night and many blessings. So thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks.